Yeah, hi everybody. So we were discussing yesterday the power of speech, the pasuk in Mishlei, Hamaves v'chayim biyad haloshain. So it's interesting, they tell a Maisa that the Chavetz Chaim, of course, was the one who popularized, he brought back to Klal Yisrael the consciousness of the Isra of Lashon Hara, right? Until the Chavetz Chaim, many people looked at Lashon Hara as a Musar thing, they didn't look at it as Mamish Halacha, even though it is. And the Chavetz Chaim codified it. The Chavetz Chaim made it a book of halachas, that it's Mamish Isra v'Heter. There are laws of Kashrus, there are laws of Shabbos, there are laws of Lashon Hara. And the Sefer was called Chavetz Chaim, who desires life, based on the pasuk in Tehillim that we say every Shabbos, Mi ish hachafetz chaim, who is the person who wants life, Ohev yamim liros tov, to see good in his life. So David HaMelech answers, Nitzor l'shaincha meira, guard your tongue from evil. Right? That's why he called the Sefer Chavetz Chaim. And Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen wrote the Sefer anonymously. So no one knew for many years, a number of years, no one knew who the author was. And he would go around selling his Svarim. He would be selling it on behalf of the author, which of course was himself. So they have Kama V'Kama Maisa, and one Maisa they have is that the Chavetz Chaim is on a train with a bunch of his Svarim, and some person says, oh wow, I've read this Sefer, the Mechaber must be a big Talmud Chacham and Tzaddik. And the Chavetz Chaim says, well, I know the guy, he's nobody special. So the person got so angry that he slaps the Chavetz Chaim in the face. He says, how dare you talk about such a tzaddik? So when they get to Warsaw, so apparently there were some people who knew the Chavetz Chaim, so there was a bit of a committee to greet him. So the man now gets a little worried, like, who did I hit? So he asks somebody, who is that person over there? He says, that's the Chavetz Chaim, this is the great Chavetz Chaim. So the man is now totally embarrassed. He goes over to the Chavetz Chaim, he begs forgiveness, he begs mechila, and the Chavetz Chaim says, you didn't do anything wrong. He says, you taught me a lesson. All my life I've been teaching people not to say Lashon Hara about other people. You taught me I shouldn't say Lashon Hara about myself either, that this was my onesh for putting myself down. So as is often the case with these simple stories of the Chavetz Chaim, there's kind of a deep lesson. And that is part of why we do have an urge to put other people down is because we have a kind of an insecurity about ourselves. Mm-hmm. We feel bad about ourselves, so if somebody is better than me in any particular way, so I want to kind of knock him down. Because we hate to be inferior vis-a-vis other people. So when you're down here and somebody's up there, there are two ways you can eliminate the imbalance. One is by dragging him down, or the other is by lifting yourself up. But gravity is an easier force to work with. It's easier to drag somebody down than to work to lift yourself up. So as a result, the Chavetz Chaim story indicates that Lashon Hara of putting people down is often going to be connected with putting yourself down. Meaning if a person is makir their own chashivas, then they'll have less of a need to put other people down, right? So Lashon Hara comes from a lack of your own inner self-esteem. When you have a healthy, this is I don't mean gaiva, of course, but if a person has a healthy sense of themselves, that they're a good person and they're working to serve Hashem, they're not going to feel a need, as it were, to kind of knock down other people. I know other people are matzliach, Baruch Hashem, that's a wonderful thing. It doesn't have to affect me and what I'm doing. But the story I wanted to tell you was this, that there was, it was interesting that when the Chavetz Chaim came out with the Sefer on Lashon Hara, it was such an unusual Sefer. Who ever heard of a Sefer that tells you what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say? I mean, who ever heard such a thing? That people actually sent spies to spy on the Chavetz Chaim to see if he really lived up to these standards. Because it was very, very difficult. We can't believe that a human being could control his speech. So the story goes that one of these spies came to the Chavetz Chaim for Shabbos, and he noticed that the Chavetz Chaim had a son-in-law who was very, very quiet. He never spoke at all unless it was Torah or mitzvos or whatever it is. He didn't speak. And the Chavetz Chaim was telling stories and telling Maisim and was very, very talkative. So the person thought, the Chavetz Chaim's son-in-law is really the hero here because he, never says anything. The Chavetz Chaim talks and schmoozes. He says, I think the son-in-law is a greater tzaddik in Shmiras HaLashon. But then he realized that as great a tzaddik as the son-in-law was, the son-in-law was simply shutting down his speech. The Chavetz Chaim was using his speech in positive ways. And that's a much more difficult avodah, right? Not that it's easy either way, but on the scale of things, it's just easier not to talk than to talk and not be over on any boundaries of Lashon Hara. And as I said before, the goal is not to be silent, because the same way that Hamaves is biyad HaLashon, the same way that death is in the hands of the tongue, life is in the hands of the tongue. Your words can give chizuk, your words can give encouragement. So the goal is not to shut up. The goal is to use your words in good and beneficial ways. When it says by the creation of Adam, Vayipach biyapav nishmas chayim, right? God breathed into the form of Adam, the form of man, nishmas chayim, the soul of life, the spirit of life. Vayipach biyapav nishmas chayim. So the Targum Onkelos says, now this is very rare. Targum Onkelos is a very literal Aramaic translation. Onkelos does not paraphrase. But here, Onkelos says, what is the nishmas chayim? What is the soul of life? What is the spirit of life? Ruach memalala, a spirit of speech, meaning the very definition of the divine soul that God breathed into us was the capacity of speech. Meaning speech is how we exemplify godliness in the world. Because remember, God created the world, the universe, by speech. That is how the Torah describes it. Vayomer Elokim, God said, God said, God said. So this is what the Targum is saying. When Hashem gave us, so to speak, the divine spirit within us, He gave us that power of speech, not just to say words, but to create worlds, meaning God gave us the koach of creation through speech that God Himself had. Now, that doesn't mean in a literal sense, meaning I can't just say, let there be a dog here and a dog is going to appear, not to that degree, but in the sense of creating good vibes, bad vibes, creating chizuk, creating destruction, creating encouragement, creating demoralization. Our words create these realities. And that is why the goal is not simply be quiet, because that simply means you're not using a divine faculty. Now, yeah, better not to use it than to use it in a destructive way. That would be true. But better to use it in a positive way than not to use it at all. And therefore the person was makir that was the greatness of the Chavetz Chaim, that he wasn't mevatel his koyach hadibor, but he used it in a positive, constructive way. And that's why the power of speech, chayim v'hamaves, biyad halashon. Okay, so that finishes, in Perek Sheni, that finishes the Tomer Devorah, looking at the different aspects of the Rosh, which correspond to the sphere of Keser, in which we try to emulate. Yeah.
When we try to speak the world that Hashem wants him to be, we're going to fail in that because we don't live up to Him. And so the world we're going to bring in is going to be some degeneration of that. Is that just an unfortunate consequence of us not being what we're supposed to be, or is that part of the point, that it's actually desirable that, like, the error that appears by you striving to bring in what Hashem wants is a good thing because it's distinct to you?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a good thing, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to try, and by definition, our efforts are not going to be totally 100%. By definition, there is a merchak. There is always going to be a chasm. There's always going to be a gap between the creator and the created. But we try to narrow that gap, although the infinity can technically never be totally narrowed. That's by definition. But we have to try. We have to try. We're mechayev to try. In other words, Voltaire said, I've mentioned it many times, that you can't allow the best to be the enemy of the better. And this is a very, very big call in Avodas Hashem, where sometimes people feel if they can't do something perfect, they're not going to try to do something at all. And that's a very big mistake. Rav Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, the co-founder of Or Sameach, whose yahrzeit is coming up, Chanukah, used to say, it's a very smart remark, he says, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Now, this is a chiddush, right? Because the way the saying normally goes is, anything worth doing is worth doing well. But he put it the opposite way. If it's worth doing, then it's worthwhile to try it, even if it's going to be not so great. Because at least you've done something, right? You've tried. And this is true in a lot of things, even in the secular, even in secular life. There are people who they sometimes say, they give surveys, like, what do you wish you would have done in your life? So people say different things. They say, I wished I would have played trombone. But I was embarrassed. It wouldn't sound good. I wished I could sing in a choir, but I don't have the greatest voice. But now they regret it. I could have sung. So a lot of times, we don't do things, whether it's in secular life or whether it's in religious life, because we're embarrassed that we're not going to do a good job. But sometimes you got to have the attitude, It's worthwhile to do something even if it's not going to be great. Maybe it'll be better than I thought it was. And in either event, something is better than nothing. Half loaf, half measures. Half measures, well, it's only a half measure. Yeah, but it's a half measure, Until you did the half thing, you had nothing. Right? So a person has 15 minutes. Let's say a person wasted a morning Seder. So you only have 15 minutes left. It's like the whole day was a waste. So a lot of times, our attitude is, it's only 15 minutes. Let me call it a day. No, the answer is no. You have 15 minutes. So why not do 15 minutes? 15 minutes is better than not having 15 minutes. They tell a Maisa with the Vilna Gaon that at various times in his life, the Vilna Gaon was in prison. He was in jail. Because there was a time in his life that he was wandering from place to place. Golos, he held that was a kapara. He was wandering anonymously. And we have different stories about things he did in these anonymous wanderings. This is when he was a young person, in his 20s and 30s, not when he was older. He was not so world famous yet, but he was still the Vilna Gaon, he was the Vilna Gaon even before people knew him as the Vilna Gaon. But he was what he was. But he would wander around, and in Europe in those days, if you didn't have the right papers, even to go to another city, even within the same country, if you didn't have identification, they put you in jail. So until somebody ransomed you or got you out. So he was in prison, and he was sharing a cell with a Jewish man who was there for murder, which is unusual. I mean, Jews commit their share of white-collar crime, maybe, but Baruch Hashem, we're not known for crimes of violence. That's kind of not our thing. We're more into income tax evasion or things like that. So the Vilna Gaon is with a Jewish guy who was at least there on murder charges. So they bring him bread, and I guess the bread they assumed was kosher. That was not a problem. And they gave him a jug of water, and the Vilna Gaon was using his water to wash his hands before the bread. And he noticed that the Rotzeach was just going to eat the bread without washing his hands. So he says to the Rotzeach, you got to do Netilas Yadayim. So the Rotzeach starts laughing. He's a big, burly guy, it's recorded, and he has big hands. And he says to the Vilna Gaon, he says, these hands, kill people. They grab people's neck. I was almost kind of threatening to the Vilna Gaon. I break necks with these hands. Do you think HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares if I pour water on them before I eat bread? And the Vilna Gaon says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu certainly cares. Do you think a Rotzeach is patur from Netilas Yadayim? He says, Ritzich is a pretty bad sin, and you're going to get a big punishment for that. But you're not patur from Netilas Yadayim. You still got to do whatever you have to do. Right? In other words, the Vilna Gaon is saying, okay, wash your hands, do a mitzvah. You got a lot of other problems, but don't add this to your list. Meaning, one should never think I'm so far gone that if I do a little bit, it's not going to count. It'll count, and maybe it'll bring it to tshuva. Chazal say mitzvah whereas mitzvah. So yeah, the point I'm just making is that the inevitable imperfection in what we do should not stop us from trying to do it. Now, there may be a cheshbon if, for example, there's a certain project and there's another person who, if they would do it better, so that might be a grounds to say, let the other person handle it. I mean, that's a separate cheshbon. But if you're simply talking about, mitzvos for yourself, then do it even if it's not going to be so great. Yeah.
Why are there not more pieces to the head enumerated? Why only 8? I feel like the chin or the beard or even head hair might.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, the truth is that all of these things do make their appearance in other contexts. In fact, the beard is a very, very big Indian in Kabbalah. There's a reference to Kabbalah to the 13 points of the beard. Somehow you divide the beard into 13 segments, and they connect you to paths of wisdom. Like the beard is almost like a USB cable to some heavenly influences. That's why even though al pi din, you are allowed to shave. You're allowed to cut your beard, provided you don't use a razor, whatever it would be. I mean, halachically, there is a halachically permissible method of shaving, right? Obviously, and I hope everyone is following the halachically permissible method of shaving. But al pi Kabbalah, there was an Indian in Kabbalah not to touch the beard at all, not even to trim the beard. That's why many Hasidim don't do it, because the beard was said to be a conduit for divine wisdom. It's interesting, though, as a little aside, one of the great Mekubalim, one of the greatest Mekubalim after the Ari, was an Italian rabbi, an Italian Kabbalist, whose name was Rav Menachem Azaria Mipano. Pano is the city in Italy. So he's called Rama Mipano, Reish Mem Ayin, not Aleph, Reish Mem Ayin Mipano. He was a great Mekubal. He wrote a Sefer Asora Ma'amarais, which is really a classic Sefer in Kabbalah. He wrote also Shelos Teshuvos in Halacha. He was also very, very wealthy. He was a friend of Rav Yosef Karo, and in fact, he paid for the printing of the Beis Yosef, which was a huge sefer. And he was the one who actually paid to get the Beis Yosef printed. And in addition to the many, many Kabbalistic writings he wrote himself, he also publicized and disseminated the Sifrei Kabbalah from Eretz Yisrael throughout Europe. So he was actually a distributor, in a sense, of Kisvei Ari throughout Europe. So we actually have a picture, a painting of Rama Mipano, and strangely enough, he doesn't have a beard. Now, this was seen as so preposterous by later generations that they airbrushed it in. They actually put in a beard, meaning that the picture would actually put in a beard, because it's not possible that he didn't have a beard. But the emes is, among the Italian Mekubalim, it was Mekubal that the inyan of having a beard was connected to the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And in Chutz La'aretz, you don't have that special conduit with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore the Gedalim, again, I mean, many Gedalim had beards, but the Mekubalim of Italy, B'dafka, the Italian Mekubalim in Italy held that there was no inyan of having a beard in Chutz La'aretz. And that's why I believe, I don't want to say it for sure, I believe Ramchal did not have a beard till he came the last 2 years of his life in Eretz Yisrael, because again, the Ramchal was from Italy, and although he lived in Amsterdam, and he was following that minhag of Rama Mipano, not to have a beard. So why the Ramak in Eretz Yisrael does not bring up the beard here? I don't know. So let me think about it, because there are certainly other parts of his writing that he does talk about the Yud Gimel pathways of the Zakan, the chin. Again, the other thing, you could subdivide the face in other ways. You can talk about the teeth, the tongue, although obviously that's connected to Lashon anyway.
I'm wondering, when it comes to going off what you said about the beard,
Yeah.
if someone is incapable of growing a beard, a thin beard, does that mean they're incapable of connecting to that higher level conduit?
Well, listen, I mean, obviously, these things are not mechanical, meaning nobody's going to say, oh, you have a beard, so you have deep understandings of life. In fact, there's an old Yiddish saying. He says, just because a goat, I wish I could say it in Yiddish, it's more colorful. Just because a goat has a beard doesn't mean it's a rabbi, so, so it's not an automatic thing. But I think we would look at it as a bit of a crutch, in a sense, meaning if one has a beard and you work and you steig, the beard will help you a little bit. If you don't have a beard, you're going to have to work harder. But that doesn't mean you can't do it.
We can't grow the beard to begin with.
Well, obviously, there's no sin involved, but it means there's a certain amount of handicap on a mystical level that you have to overcome. But 1,000%, one can vade overcome it. There's no question about it. In fact, another thing the Satmar Rebbe said, is similar to the Yiddish saying, but a little different way. There was a great lay leader, the head of Agudas Yisrael in America, and really the worldwide organization, was a man, Rav Moshe Scherer. In fact, there's a biography of him. He was one of the great Askanim in the world. He was close to Rav Aaron Kotler. He was close to all the Gedolim. And he didn't have a beard, though, because he was always negotiating with Washington, presidents, he was politically connected, so he felt he had to look. In those days, beards were not worn by the general public. Now, actually, a beard is more common, even among people who aren't Jewish. But in those days, a beard wouldn't look good in the White House, etc. So he felt, in order to negotiate with politicians at a very high level, he didn't have a beard. Now, the Satmar Rebbe, who was really against Aguda generally, was very close to Rav Moshe Scherer. He spoke to Rav Moshe Scherer. He respected him. So some of his Hasidim went to the Satmar Rebbe and says, how can you respect a man without a beard? How can you have kavod for a man without a beard? So he said, better to be a Yid without a beard than a beard without a Yid. Meaning the idea is that sometimes people have the externalities, but they're not really inside. They're not really Jewish. He says, Moshe Scherer is a Yid without a beard, okay? But a lot of people are beards without the Yid, and that's a much worse thing. So again, I can't tell you exactly what it is that a person would be missing, but the Mekubalim say that there is something that the beard can help a person, but only, of course, with their own avodah. So I don't know, something to think about why those other inyanim are not mentioned. Okay. All right, so actually I thought that I'm going to take a break in the middle. I'm going to switch topics right away for the next few days. I want to talk about Chanukah. I wanted to finish this particular section. And here I just want to raise an interesting question. If you ask anybody, why is there a holiday called Chanukah? So people will say, oh, Baruch Hashem, we regained the Beis HaMikdash from the Greeks out of Syria, and we discovered a jar of oil, and there was only enough oil to burn for 1 day, and there was a miracle, it burnt for 8 days. So we have a holiday to commemorate the miracle of oil that burnt for 8 days. Now, l'chaira, one can show for a variety of sources that this is not why there's a holiday of Chanukah. Of course, the miracle happened. God forbid. No one is denying. This miracle did happen. But this is not the reason for the Yom Tov of Chanukah. Proof number one is the special Al Hanisim prayer that we say in Shmoneh Esrei and Birkat Hamazon. Al Hanisim totally discusses the fact that this nation of Yavan wanted to take us away from the Torah, not let us do mitzvos. And God, in His mercy, helped us defeat this enemy that tried to destroy the Torah. God helped us. He delivered the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the Rishayim in the hands of the tzaddikim. So the whole tenor of Al Hanisim, which by the way is a very early prayer, Al Hanisim may have been written as early as the Maccabees themselves, as early as the Milchama, which is approximately 180 BCE, 180 before the Common Era. So the Al Hanisim emphasizes the Gamri, the Nitzachain of Milchama, as well as the cleansing and purification and rededication of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, it's true, there is one reference in Al Hanisim to the lighting of candles in your holy courtyard. V'idliku neiros b'chatzreis kadshecha. But that doesn't mention a miracle. I mean, it doesn't say, if I read that sentence, there's nothing miraculous in that statement. They lit candles. Meaning, it's simply describing the purification of the Beis HaMikdash. We came to the Beis HaMikdash and we purified it. And we were able to light candles. So to read that the Al Hanisim is talking about the holiday of Chanukah from the perspective of the miracle of the Pach HaShemen is very much of a stretch, because that miracle in the Al Hanisim is not alluded to at all. Remember what's going on here. The Yevanim took over Eretz Yisrael. Again, to go back a little bit historically, what's going on? It really starts with Alexander the Great, as he's called in history. We don't necessarily call him great, but he's called Alexander Muktan, which is Alexander of Macedonia. And Alexander the Great toppled the Persian Empire. Right? The Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by Babylon, then Persia conquered Babylonia. That's when you have Koresh, Achashverosh. And then, towards the end of the reign of Darius II, that is when Alexander came. So this is already after the Tanakh, right? The last non-Jewish king that is mentioned in Tanakh is Darius II, under whose reign the second Beis HaMikdash was built. Chazal say, although it's not in the biblical text, that this is the son that Esther had from Achashverosh. So he technically was Jewish. And he is the one that gave the Jews permission to rebuild the Bayis Sheni. And that was the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, etc. And that's as far as the biblical period, meaning the biblical period ends with essentially, maybe a few years afterwards, the dedication of the Bayis Sheni. Shortly thereafter came the Greek period, when Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, but that is post-biblical. So the whole story of Chanukah is not in Tanakh because it is post-biblical. Unlike the story of Esther, which was under Persian rule. Right? Esther happened towards the end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, because it was Achashverosh's son who allowed the Jews to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. Now, when Alexander died very young. Alexander died at 31. And the Persian Empire was huge, and Alexander had conquered most of the known world. And he died in a campaign in Africa where he contracted a disease. Some say he was poisoned and the like. And legend has it that Alexander died of grief because he was only 31, and he said, "There are no more worlds for me to conquer." And whatever it is, he died. So when he died, he had a child from Roxanne, was one of his mistresses or wives. I don't remember if a wife or a mistress. This was a little baby, and the little baby mysteriously died shortly after Alexander died. And most people assume that the baby was killed because they didn't want the baby to have some claim to this great empire. So Alexander's empire was divided among 4 generals. Each of them established empires. And for purposes of Eretz Yisrael and Jewish history, 2 of the 4 are very important. Talmai, the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy, established his reign in Egypt and North Africa. Seleucus established his reign in Turkey and Syria. In fact, Syria was his place. Antioch in Syria was his capital. So you have Ptolemy to the south, Egypt and North Africa. You have Seleucus to the north, Syria. These are the successors to Alexander the Great. two of the four. The other two had no connection with Jewish history. And indeed, in the book of Daniel, if you've ever read the book of Daniel, where Daniel has all sorts of mysterious visions, and this is during the Persian period, but he has visions about the future. There's a long, long story about the wars between the king of the north and the king of the south. And almost all of the Mefarshim understand that these are predictions regarding the constant wars between the Seleucid dynasty of Syria and the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. Because if you can envision this on a map, you can see that Eretz Yisrael is like right in between those two empires. So there were constant wars between them, and Eretz Yisrael, like a football, was going back and forth. Sometimes Eretz Yisrael, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, right at the beginning of the Second Temple period, were under Ptolemaic rule. Sometimes they were under Seleucid rule, back and forth. And of course, in Alexandria itself, which had a huge Jewish population, they were always under Ptolemaic rule, because that's a separate thing. Now, the Jewish community in Alexandria was a very assimilated community, but they were largely Hellenized. They were influenced by Greek culture and like. So it's important to understand that people wonder sometimes, why do we talk about the Greeks? I mean, Greece, nobody from Athens attacked Eretz Yisrael. But the understanding is that because both the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty were the successors of Alexander, their culture was Hellenistic culture. They weren't coming from the country Greece. They were not coming from Greece, but their culture was Hellenization. Now, the thing is, Alexander had a huge empire, right? Let's go back when Alexander was still alive. Alexander had a huge, huge empire. And one very major issue that you have when you have a huge empire is, how do you unify people that have different cultures and different behaviors? So Alexander was a great admirer of Hellenism, although Alexander was not a native Greek. Alexander was Macedonia, right? Macedonia was a separate country, actually. But Alexander was a great admirer of Greece, and part of that was that his father Philip, who was king of Macedonia, hired a very, very good tutor for his son, and it just shows you that when you have money, you can do anything. He actually hired Aristotle to be Alexander's private tutor. So Aristotle was widely known as the most learned, let's say non-Jewish, the most learned non-Jew in the world. And and even Aristotle could use some extra bucks, or whatever the currency was, and he actually gave private lessons to Alexander. So Alexander was very enamored with Hellenistic culture. But what's interesting is, he didn't spread it by coercion, he spread it by assimilation, meaning Alexander had this idea of exposing populations to theaters, to athletic events, Greek philosophy. So the truth of the matter is, the Hellenization of many countries was proceeding apace in a non-coercive way. Alexander was not spreading it by coercion, and unfortunately many Jews in Eretz Yisrael fell prey to Hellenistic influences, not because of Antiochus, he didn't show up until later, but they were just assimilated, just like in the United States. You have intermarriage, you have assimilation, you have not keeping the mitzvos, not learning Torah. This was happening. And this process of what you might call voluntary Hellenization continued under Seleucus out of Syria and under Ptolemy in Egypt. Okay? Now, this happened for over 150 years, meaning you had Alexander, and then you had, in fact, there's one story we have about Alexander, which is actually relevant to our street here. And that is, the Gemara in Yuma tells us that Alexander was relatively benign. Alexander was pushing assimilation for sure, but he was not pushing coercion. He didn't make any laws against doing mitzvahs. But he had heard, people had given him a false report, that the Jews were planning to revolt and overthrow his rule. So Alexander decided he would destroy the Beis Hamikdash to quell Jewish defiance. And as he was headed, he ruled over it. He was the ruler of Israel, but he wanted to come and destroy the second Mikdash. And as he was approaching to destroy the Beis Hamikdash, so the Kohen Gadol at the time was Shimon HaTzadik, who was a Kohen Gadol for 40 years. And Shimon HaTzadik came out to greet Alexander and to beg him to have rachamim, etc. It was an eis sakana mamish. And when Alexander saw Shimon HaTzadik, the Gemara in Yuma says he got off his horse. His horse is also famous in mythology, Alexander's magic horse or whatever it was. He got off the horse, he got on his knees and he bowed down. And he said to Shimon HaTzadik, "You're the person I see before I go to war that tells me if I will be successful or not. You are the shaliach that God sends to tell me what I should do." And he recognized the righteousness of Shimon HaTzadik, and because of that, Alexander called off his campaign against Jerusalem. And it is recorded that that year, every Jewish boy that was born was given the name Alexander to commemorate that event. And that is how Alexander became a name by which you can call people to the Torah. Now, Alexander is not a Hebrew name. Alexander is a Greek name, or a Macedonian. It's not Hebrew. And yet, it became a Shem Kodesh, because all the way back then, people named their children Alexander in Eretz Yisrael, so that became a Shem Kodesh. So a person could be called to the Torah. Your Hebrew names, it's not a Hebrew name, it's a misnomer, but your Hebrew name can actually be Alexander. So that's a good story that we have about Alexander, that he spared Yerushalayim because of Shimon HaTzadik. The Gemara in Yuma says, interestingly enough, that Shimon HaTzadik came out with his big day kahuna. He wore the garments of the Kohen Gadol, and that raises enormous halachic questions, because a Kohen Gadol, any Kohen, is not supposed to wear big day kahuna outside of the Beis Hamikdash. This is a whole discussion in halacha. Why was it mutter to do it? But whatever, he felt that the uniform would give him greater credibility, and it was a matter of pikuach nefesh, etc. Okay. So Alexander dies, and you have the civil wars between Seleucus and Ptolemy, and the Chanukah story is situated at a time when a Seleucid king, Antiochus the fourth, that's our Antiochus, the bad Antiochus of the Chanukah story, had conquered the land of Israel in a military campaign against the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay, so the football went back and forth. It happened to be Antiochus is now in charge. Now Antiochus was called, actually he gave himself the name, Antiochus Epiphanes, which is Greek for Antiochus the Divine, because he considered himself to be on that level. Behind his back, even the non-Jews of the reign called him Antiochus Epimanes. Instead of Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes, which means Antiochus the Insane. Of course, this is behind his back, because he kind of had the opposite of an inferiority complex. He had a certain grandiose personality cult in which he considered himself to be a god, and people thought he was crazy. Antiochus was impatient with the rate of Hellenization and assimilation that actually, we consider it to be a very bad development, but it was going quite well, meaning quite well means quite bad, meaning more and more Jews were assimilating anyway. It was a natural process. But there were still some Jews that were holding out. So Antiochus invented the notion of prohibiting religious practices. Now, it's hard to believe, because we have all sorts of bad guys before Antiochus, right? We had Paro, and then we have Haman, and we had plenty of bad people. But it is fascinating. Sancheriv, Nebuchadnezzar. Antiochus is the first king who enacted anti-Torah laws. Every other king, enslaved us, wanted to kill us. But they didn't specifically say, Nebuchadnezzar never said, you can't do mitzvahs. One time he said, you got to bow down to my statue. But even that was not to take Jews away from mitzvahs. That was just to glorify him. But a specific law that was targeted against the doing of mitzvos, this was uniquely Antiochus. It's hard to realize this. He is the first king who specifically wanted to uproot the Torah. That was not Haman's agenda. That was not Nebuchadnezzar's agenda. That was not Paro's agenda. It was Antiochus' agenda. And the intention was that if Jews would give up mitzvos like Shabbos and Bris Milah and Kashrus and Taras and Mishpach and a mikveh, a whole list of things, then they would be like everybody else and we would have a good society. In a perverse way, you could almost say Antiochus was an enlightened person. He was not anti-Semitic. Antiochus was willing to give Jews 100% political and civil rights as long as they go with the plan. See, not like Hitler, right? Hitler, Haman. They were working the opposite way. They wanted to kill Jews. They didn't care if you were from or not from. In fact, in the Holocaust, people who converted to Christianity still were sent to the concentration camps. So Hitler, Haman, they represent the people, maybe Hamas, they represent the people who want to destroy Jews no matter what. Antiochus is a very different enemy. Antiochus didn't want to destroy Jews in a physical sense. Antiochus wanted to destroy Judaism. And if you give up your Judaism, you're welcome to be part of his society. And why did he want to destroy Judaism? Because he thought Judaism was interfering with the homogenization and the spread of Hellenist culture, which would strengthen his position. This is why the Levush says an interesting point. The Levush says that we know on Purim there's a chiyuv to have a seudah. You have to eat food on Purim. Chanukah, there is no chiyuv. There's a minhag, people have seudas, but there's no chiyuv to have latkes. There's no chiyuv to wash for sure. Except on Shabbos, you do anyway. But there's no chiyuv seudah. Now the question is, both of them are a celebration of a Yeshua. So why is there a chiyuv of seudah on Purim and not on Chanukah? Says the Levush, Purim is a sakana to our body. Therefore we thank Hashem by our body doing something, eating. Chanukah, the danger was not to our bodies. The danger was to our neshamos. Therefore we celebrate by lighting candles, which is a remez to the neshama of a person. As the pasuk says in Mishlei, Ner Hashem, Nishmas Adam, a person's neshama is a candle from Hashem. Yes, it's true that Chanukah morphed into a military war in which our lives were threatened. That's true, it was a war. But the only reason there was a war was over the spiritual conflict. Had the Jews gone along, and many Jews did, had the Jews gone along with the assimilation, there would have been no war. Antiochus was not an anti-Semite, to use a later term, in the way Hitler was. Okay, so it's important to understand that the whole war of the Maccabees is about Ruchnius and Torah. It is not about freedom. It is not about political independence. It turned into that because that's how we were able to achieve the Torah. Okay, so we'll talk more about this, but that's the first thing to keep in mind, that essentially Hellenism was happening already, and many, many Jews were Hellenists without Antiochus, without persecution. They just went with it. Just like in America, you have 70% intermarriage. Nobody's forcing them to marry Goyim. They're just doing it. But Antiochus wanted to hurry it up, and therefore he engaged in this anti-Torah laws, in which if you were caught doing these different mitzvahs, you would be killed. And the Maccabim is essentially a revolt against the anti-Torah laws. And this is what the Al-Anisim says. Yavan Malchus HaRisha Alamcha Yisrael, that the evil kingdom of Yavan stood up against your nation Yisrael. And what was their purpose? Lahashkicham Torasecha, to make them forget your Torah. Ulahaviram, and to remove them mechuke ritzonecha, from the laws of your Ratzon. This is what the war of Chanukah represents. That's why it's kind of an irony that the Jewish Olympic-style games are called the Maccabee Games, because the Olympics were a facet of Greek culture. They would go naked and everything else, and the whole Maccabee revolt was against Greek culture. So to use their name in connection with kind of a Greek thing, is a little strange, but so be it. Unfortunately, in popular culture and maybe less religious Judaism, they say the Maccabees stand for freedom and the like. When in fact they were fighting for freedom, but they were fighting for freedom to keep the Torah. They weren't fighting for. I'll give you an example of perversion. And this was an Orthodox rabbi, which makes it even worse. An Orthodox rabbi was testifying. I shouldn't call him Orthodox, but officially he's Orthodox. He was testifying in the Maine state legislature that the legislature ought to legalize gay marriage. That itself is a chilul Hashem. But what makes it worse is it's Chanukah time, and this idea of freedom is what the Maccabean revolt stood for. So therefore, especially during Chanukah, it's important that we give people the freedom to make their choices, because freedom of choice is what the Maccabees gave their lives for. Well, you see, it's kind of a bizarro world where things are the opposite. The Maccabees fought, so we should be able to keep the Torah. They didn't fight to be able to break the Torah. Okay? Again, we'll continue with the history of it a little later on. Okay. Good day.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.